Picking up at Genesis chapter 32, verse 13. And he lodged there that same night, and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother. Notes, now praying and planning will never go together. If I plan, I am leaning more or less on my plan. But when I pray, I should lean exclusively upon God. Hence the two things are perfectly incompatible. They virtually cancel each other out. When my eyes fill with my own management of things, I am not prepared to see God acting for me. And in that case, prayer is not the utterance of my need, but the mere superstitious performance of something which I think ought to be done, or it may be asking God to sanctify my plans. Well, if I were to do that, this will never do. The life of faith is not asking God to sanctify and bless my means, but it is asking Him to do it all Himself. And on another side note, I'd like to say that a peace treaty, very poorly conceived, leads to bigger problems. And as a matter of fact, a good example of that was in 1995, if I remember correctly, Israel giving over the Gaza Strip. Those terrorist people over there have set up their little camps there, and they're now firing rockets as of right now. Going on to verse 14. 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cattle, and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. And he delivered them into the hand of his servants, every drove by themselves, and said unto his servants, Pass over before me, and put a space between drove and drove. And he commanded the foremost, notes, that's the men who are the men in the lead, saying, When Esau my brother meets you, and asks you, saying, For whom do you work, and where are you going, and whose are these before you? Then you shall say, They be your servant Jacob's. It is a present sent unto you, my lord Esau, and behold, also he, Jacob, is behind us. And so commanded he the second and the third, and all that followed the droves, saying, On this manner shall you speak unto Esau when you find him. And say ye moreover, Behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure he will accept me. Peradventure he will accept of me. Notes, in 2003 currency, these gifts would be quite a bit over $100,000. Jacob's idea was that the gifts to Esau would be given drove by drove. If he accepted them, this would mean that he came to Jacob in peace. No sooner had the patriarch quit praying that he started planning, which means that he really wasn't trusting the Lord as he should have been. It's verse 21. So went the present over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company. Notes, this seems to be referring to either the closest friends or family. That's what I get from that. Verse 22. And he rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them who were his friends and family and sent them over the brook and he sent over that he had. Notice, the brook Jabbok crosses the Jordan about 30 to 40 miles north of the Dead Sea. Verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Notes, the word man in this particular scripture is in the first letter of the word man is capital, meaning that it's also a name. When the Bible does that, it can often does refer to Christ or God. In this chapter and in Hosea chapter 12, this man is called God, the angel, Elohim, Sabaoth, and Jehovah. In this scenario, we find that it was not with Esau, his brother, with whom he had to contend, but with Jehovah himself. And this is always the case with every single believer. And verse 25, and when he saw who was the Lord, that he prevailed not against him, who was Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, who was Jacob's thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Notice, the great principle that God cannot give victory to the flesh appears in this night scene. It is the broken heart that begins to experience what divine power means. Better for the sun to rise upon a limping Israel than to set upon a lying Jacob. Jacob, for his misconduct, was exiled from the promised land, having nothing but his staff. He returns a wealthy prince, but lamed. So Israel, cast out of Jehovah's land because of her sin, will return with abundance, but broken and contrite spirit. Verse 26, and he who was the Lord said, let me go, for the day breaks. And he said, who was Jacob, I will not let you go except you bless me. Notes, when sore broken by the mighty hand, he ceased to wrestle and clung with weeping and supplication to the very God who wounded him. And then it was that he got the victory in the glorious name of Israel. Very, very, very big principle there. Verse 27. And he who was the Lord said unto him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Notes, well, of course, the Lord already knew Jacob's name. He's not asking for information. So why did he insist on Jacob pronouncing his name? He wanted Jacob to admit who and what he actually was, which the name Jacob actually portrayed. If you remember correctly, it is to be a supplanter, a deceiver, the kind of person that wouldn't think twice about sticking a knife in your back, and, well, they named him very appropriately. True faith requires that we admit what we are before we can receive what he actually is, who is the Lord. Verse 28, and he who was the Lord said, your name shall be no more called Jacob, but Israel. Notes, the deceiver and the supplanter is now changed to a prince of God, which is what Israel actually translates to. Scripture, for as a prince have you power with God and with men, and have prevailed. Notes, as we shall see, Jacob's change was instant, but yet at the same time it was also gradual. Verse 29, and Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray you, your name. And he said, wherefore is it that you do ask after my name? Notes, now the Lord's answer is quite revealing when you look at it. He responds with another question. The idea is Jacob by now ought to know who the one is with whom he had been struggling. And the next statements prove that he did. Scripture, and he who was the Lord blessed him who was Jacob there. Notes, he gave him power with himself and with men. Verse 30, and Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means the face of God. For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Notes, Jacob will never be the same again. And on a side note, that this scene where Jacob actually sees God face to face does not literally mean that they talk face to face. For those who look God face to face will surely die. This means that they had a talking to. Oh, gee, and where were we? We'll have to start again at Genesis chapter 32, verse 31. Thank you for your